Chapter 4, Up the Mountain of Injury. Finally, Much Afraid was traveling toward the high places. It was amazing how quickly she went with her strong helpers, Sorrow and Suffering. The path was quite smooth, and before long, they were near the mountains. As they got closer, Much Afraid began to worry. The mountains looked so steep. In the late afternoon, the path led them to the rocky cliffs. In every direction, the mountains were like walls that went straight up. And there she is with her little helpers right here, Sorrow and Suffering, and that's Much Afraid. The cliffs completely blocked their path. There was no sign of a track anywhere, and it would be impossible for them to climb. They would have to turn back. Just then, Suffering pointed to the rocky walls. 2 deer were leaping up the cliff. The hart led the way, and the hind followed him exactly. They leaped and sprang in perfect ease up and up the rocky wall and disappeared over the top. Much Afraid began to tremble, and her knees shook. Suffering and Sorrow took her hands in theirs. Do not be afraid. We don't have to turn around after all. The hart and the hind will show us the way. We'll just have to follow where they went. Oh, no, no way, Much Afraid cried out. It is impossible. The deer may be able to go up there, but I certainly can't. I wouldn't be sure to fall on all those awful rocks. She began sobbing. I can't do it. I can't. I'll never be able to get up to the high places. And she crouched to the ground, completely exhausted. They heard a crunching sound and a rattling of loose stones. Then a voice came beside her. Ha ha, my dear little cousin, we meet at last. Much Afraid found herself looking right in the face of Craven Fear. You little fool, he continued. Do you really think that you could escape me for good? No, 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 Much Afraid. You are one of the Fearings. You will always be one of the Fearings. You'll never change. I have come to take you back to the valley right where you belong. I won't go with you, cried Much Afraid. Well, you can take your choice, sneered Craven Fear, pointing up the rocky cliff. Take a good look way, way up there. My, it makes me dizzy just thinking of poor little you trying to climb that terrible wall of rock. Just picture yourself slipping and struggling, and oh, what a long way it would be if you happened to fall. Much Afraid, said her helpers, shaking her shoulders gently. Much Afraid. You know what to do. Call for help. She clung to them and sobbed. I'm afraid to call. I'm so afraid that if I call him, he will tell me that I must go that way, that awful, terrible way. It's impossible. I can't face it. What should I do? Sorrow bent over and said gently but firmly, you must call for him, Much Afraid. Call for him at once. I can't, she trembled. This time I just can't. Craven Fear stepped forward and laughed loudly. Quickly, her 2 helpers put themselves between him and Much Afraid. Then Suffering looked at Sorrow, who nodded back. Suffering reached and poked Much Afraid sharply, as only Suffering can. Much Afraid cried out and looked around helplessly. Then she did what she should have done the moment they reached the impossible-looking wall. She called to the shepherd. Shepherd, help me! My fears are more than I can handle. As she lifted her voice, Craven Fear scurried away. Hello, Much Afraid, the shepherd greeted her brightly. What is the matter? Don't be afraid. I'm here. He sounded so cheerful and so full of strength that Much Afraid felt as if a stream of courage was flowing into her just from his presence. She had been worried that he might be angry with her for listening again to her fears. She sat up and looked at him and saw that he was smiling, with no trace of anger in his face at all. Thankfulness filled her heart, and the icy fear melted away. Much Afraid, he said gently. Tell me what is the matter. Why were you so afraid? It is the way you have chosen for me to go, she whispered. It looks so impossible. I feel like I might faint whenever I look up. The deer can go up there, but not me, a limping, crippled jellyfish like me. But Much Afraid, what promises did I make you in the valley? The shepherd asked with a smile. Much Afraid looked surprised. Then fear crept into her heart again. You promised that you would make my feet like Hinds Feet, that I would run and leap on the high places, she said weakly. Well, he answered cheerfully. The only way to do that is to go to the path that the hinds use, just like this. Much Afraid trembled. Then I don't think I want Hinds Feet. she said. Instead of being disappointed, the shepherd actually laughed. "Huh, oh, yes, you do," he said cheerfully. "I know you better than you know yourself. You want Hinds Feet very much. In fact, that is why I brought you to the side of this mountain. Here the cliffs are very steep, and the only way up is the tracks that the deer use. So the promise I made to you will start to come true. What did I say to you the last time that we met?" "You said, 'Now you will see what I will do,'" she answered. "But I never dreamed you would do something like this. It's too, she fumbled for words, then suddenly burst out laughing. "Why, it just doesn't make sense. Whatever will you do next?" The shepherd laughed too. "I love doing things that don't seem to make sense," he replied. "Why, I don't know anything more delightful than turning weakness into strength, fear into faith, and something crooked into something beautiful. The thing I would most enjoy right now is turning a jellyfish into a mountain goat. That is my special work," he added with great joy in his face. Taking Much Afraid, for example, and changing her into," he broke off laughing. "Well, we shall see what she finds herself changed into." What a difference the shepherd made. A short time ago, Much Afraid had been full of fear and worry. Now she and the shepherd were sitting together on the rocks laughing. "Come now, little jellyfish," said the shepherd. "Do you believe that I can change you into a mountain goat and get you to the top of this rocky cliff?" "Yes," she answered. Then she knelt and built a little altar like the one she had made before going into the desert. On it, she laid her will, her desire to do what she wanted instead of what he wanted. Fire came from somewhere, and she among the ashes a larger and rougher stone than any of the others. She placed it carefully into the little bag and stood up. The shepherd spoke. This cliff leads up Mount Injury. Injury means being hurt or treated wrongly. On the way here, you have been learning the lesson of acceptance with joy. Now it is time to learn a new lesson. As you meet injury and overcome it, you will discover what the new lesson is." The shepherd gently put his hand on her and blessed her. Then he called her helpers and pulled out a strong rope from a crack in the rocky wall. He carefully tied them together. Sorrow was in front and Suffering behind, with Much Afraid in the middle. So the two who were so strong and sure-footed went before and after to keep her safe. Then the shepherd gave her a small bottle. He told her that if she felt weak or faint on the way up, to drink a little from it. The label on the bottle read, "Spirit of Grace and Comfort." Much Afraid tried a drop or two and immediately felt stronger and ready to begin the climb. By this time, it was late afternoon. The shepherd told them to begin at once. "There is a cave farther up the hill, up the cliff, which you can't see from here. You can rest here tonight. If you stay down here, your enemies will sure be able to pay you a visit. So you have to be able to move quickly. They won't follow you up the cliff, but," he added warningly, "you will probably meet them again when you have reached the top." With that, he smiled brightly, and Sorrow put her foot on the narrow little track which zigzagged up the rocky wall. Much Afraid followed next, and then Suffering. They were on their way up Mount Injury. When the shepherd, okay, so now are some questions that I'm going to ask, and then we'll talk about it. When the shepherd came to her rescue at the foot of the mountain, why did he ask Much Afraid what was wrong? Didn't he already know? Yes, he already knew, but he wanted her to tell him. God wants us to pour out our hearts to him. He wants us to learn to be honest about our feelings. Then he can help us change the way that we feel about them. In the Bible, a man named David knew how to do this. He wrote many of the Psalms, and often he spoke about feeling overwhelmed. He told God how he really felt, and then by the end of the psalm, he was praising the Lord. It's the same when we pour our hearts out to the Lord. It gets things out and we feel better.